Hi, everyone. My name is Peter Mark Verwoerd. I'm a solution architect for Google Cloud. I focus on migration solutions and help customers basically discover what Google Cloud is and how to use it and how to move to it.
And hi, I'm Brian Stark. I'm a product manager in Google Cloud Platform. I'm responsible for basically the same topic.
So the two of us end up talking to a lot of customers about how Google Cloud works for them and how they can migrate to Google Cloud and kind of what are the best practices, how to do it, and what are the motivations and kind of what are the consequences of that. And so what we'd like to do for the next hour, or maybe a little bit less, is talk to you a little bit about some of the common scenarios and some of the things that we see in migrations. And where the title comes from of a single migrated application is, I think a lot of the time when we go into customers, I think there is a bit of an uncertainty to the scope of the problem, the size of the problem. And so we thought we'd bring it down to the scale of a single application. What does it look like to do the one application? Because I think that's much more manageable and conceptually it's easier to handle. So you've made this big decision. Yay, we're going to the cloud. Now what? You've got a data center. Inside that data center, you got services, applications, something somebody wrote about 4 years ago. Nobody knows how it works. You've got databases that are running, storage media that you're running, and is that a Solaris box in the background? Like, I don't even know what's going on. I mean, at a certain point, you start feeling overwhelmed with all the stuff that's in there. Do you want to give up? I mean, do you want to just say no?
Stop. Don't give up. As it turns out, migrating to the cloud can be a lot of work, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming work. We've worked with a lot of customers migrating, and it can be a straightforward process. A migration has parallels to building a house, which is probably why we use this analogy so often. And you're going to move into this house. But before you can move into your house, you have to put the things that the house needs, like a plumbing and a foundation. Otherwise, you'd just dropping your furniture into an empty lot, and we don't want to do that. So before we move into this house, we need to put it in the plumbing. This is what I like to refer to as the Google plumbing. You need to have a Google account. You need to create an organization. You need to set up the billing. These are all basics you need to do before a single VM gets started. And while some of this is Google account related, there are also some things you need to decide as a policy. Of course, the first thing you need to do is create a Google Cloud account. But there's much more to be done before you can start moving an application. Let's go into the rest of this individually. The most important bit of Google plumbing to set up is IAM. IAM can be complicated, but basically comes down to what can you do? Who can do something? An identity. What can they do? A policy. To what? A resource. It's important to decide who will be able to do what when you start. And it may not be exactly the right kind, but it's better than having no policy and implementing it later. Extending our analogy, it's kind of like installing plumbing after your house has been built. It's possible, but it's messy. So how do we set this up?
This is actually one of my colleagues, Vic, very animatedly talking about the various ways that customers can actually set up the various aspects of, say, the Google plumbing before they move in. And I love his animation, so I shamelessly steal his GIF. So the reality is there's actually no one way of doing this precisely. There's no one formula that fits every single customer. But we do offer, when we speak to customers who have these kinds of questions about setting up before they start migrating, so there are a lot of best practices that we can recommend. So going through a few of these, certainly principle of least privilege is something that we preach relatively constantly to everyone. The idea of handing out only what permissions people need in order to accomplish the job that they're doing, rather than handing out permissions indiscriminately. You don't want to necessarily make all your developers owners of every single project or owners of the entire organization. You want to kind of restrict that permission, say, like ownership of a development project or being able to deploy but not necessarily to terminate, all these other things. Or, for example, like billing ownership and being able to determine where the bill goes and what projects are billing. These are important permissions that you want to appropriately assign as necessary. So, I mean, you don't want to restrict somebody from doing their job, but you also don't want to necessarily give them more permission than they need to be able to do it. Secondly, using groups actually makes managing permissions much easier than having to manage individual permissions on their own. Having to manage individual identities and send out individual identities and switching roles and then switching what they can do, what they can't do, it's operationally more burdensome, and it leads to things falling through the cracks. Being able to use groups means that you can assign permission to groups, and long-term, these groups are supposed to be able to do things. People come and go from the groups, but their permissions don't move. So for example, let's say you had a network security group. They are responsible for setting all the firewall rules, all the networking rules, when networks are created and destroyed, and so on. Rather than assigning that bit of permission, those permission sets to individuals, when they join the network security team, you assign that to the group. People come and go within that team, but the permissions never have to change. It's a lot less to manage, and it's a lot less error prone. Similarly, actually controlling who can set the policy, so the watchers of the watchers, as it were, is very important. Being able to determine what group of people are going to say, yes, these are the appropriate permissions for this group of people, and that's the appropriate permissions for that group of people. It's very important to be able to manage that at a very granular level. You don't want to hand that kind of permission out to a lot of different people. That should be a smaller group that has the authority, that has the institutional process and know-how as to who should be assigned to what and be able to do what. So it's a very small group of people, but you want to make sure it's fairly restricted. And another way to increase your permission setup before you start moving to Google Cloud is to make sure to invest in looking at audit logs. This is a part of Stackdriver. We audit every single API call that you make. Look at these audit logs, start using these audit logs, be familiar with these audit logs, because you want to know what is being done at any given point within the overall Google environment. And then this was something else Brian briefly touched on, is setting up your organization. So within Google Cloud, you can use what we call Cloud Resource Manager to be able to create an organization that maps to your literal organization. So at the top, there's this concept of an organizational node, and billing can flow up and permissions flow down. And so being able to set this up from the start, before you start moving things, before you start instantiating virtual machines, databases, what have you, is really, really important. Again, it's the kind of thing you could do later on, but it's messy. And so there are a couple of different ways that people take the organization concept and decide how to use the projects underneath it. I'm going to walk through 3 of these really briefly, because the first concept is the easiest one to understand. All right, we're going to have one organization, one project. Everyone's going to swim inside this big pool of the single project, and everything gets deployed in there. And conceptually, that's really easy to manage and figure out. But the downside is actually quotas and permissions are tied to the project. So if, let's say, you've got 2 teams that want to use databases, and you've allocated quota for, say, Bigtable to one team, and the other team just grabs it first, well, within the construct of the project, there's nothing really preventing them from doing that. So you end up getting a lot of quota contention if a lot of different teams are sharing the same project. Next option is kind of to divide it up, say, along divisional lines or broader groups, which is a little bit easier. You get less contention over resources, but it kind of fairly quickly devolves into what the first option looks like, where it's not really enough separation to make anyone happy. What we generally recommend, and this is kind of how Google works, is actually projects divided up by kind of the, say, the feature or the product level. So a product team or a feature team would own a particular project for their own feature in their own project. They get quota based on what they need to do. They're not sharing it with other teams, and that's kind of the level of ownership that we recommend. What is also helpful at this level is that not only are our quotas divided by projects, but permissions. So permissions can filter down from the top and be able to be separated out at the project level, which is also very handy for being able to kind of appropriately divide up different teams. So there you go.
Yeah, and finally, what considerations are there for regions? If you guys watched this morning, we announced a whole bunch of new regions. We're now up to, I think, 17 is what's been announced. But there could be regulatory, political, or policy reasons why you don't want to have your data in certain regions. Some companies want to keep their data in the U.S. Recently, a lot more want to keep it out of the U.S. Some want to have it in the EU. Some don't want it in the EU. So you need to have a policy of where applications reside. You want it to be as close to the user base as possible generally, but you have to deal with your policy compliance issues. And you also want to limit the amount of overhead in your IT team supporting multiple regions. So all of these must be considered before you're, if you don't kind of do this ahead of time, what's going to happen is your developers are going to start picking, and then you'll be stuck with region sprawl all over the place.
All right, Brian. So we covered everything. Now we can talk about migrating something,
so
right?
We're building a house.
Yeah.
We put some pipes in the ground, and you're ready to move in?
Can we not?
No, no, we are not ready to move at this point, Peter Mark.
Fine.
We have to do the next part, which is the foundation. It's a concrete slab. This is what sits on top of the Google plumbing, the decisions that come from your processes in your company. What kind of network are you going to use? What kind of connectivity will you have to your existing data centers? What will your developer workflow look be? And we need to look at each of these.
So, unlike the project structure where we generally recommend that third option where each team gets their own project, the network design is actually something that could be, you could credibly say that we want to use a bunch of these different options or one of them. This is not one of those suggestions where this one is better and that one is not. These are all kind of valid. So the first one that we're going to talk about is basically network islands, and that each project or each service, whatever it is, kind of lives within its own isolated island. And the only exposure it has to the outside world is, say, via an API or some sort of consumable resource that other projects, other consumers, whether they're internal or external, can hit. And as far as the rest of the outside world is concerned, it's a black box. And so that kind of connectivity means that it's a very, very high level of isolation. It's limiting the blast radius for any kind of issues that come up. But it also means that it's you really need to be very good at knowing what your outside consumers, whether they're colleagues, whether they're people internally who are consuming these resources or externally, you really need to know what that is. Next option is a slight variation on this, doing network peering, where you connect different networks as necessary, say over direct links though. So you connect the network, say over a VPN. And this is another model that we see a lot of, in particular with companies that are creating networks for different groups inside the cloud, but also want to connect back to, say, an existing data center and be able to connect back to networks there. This kind of fits in with the mental model of what they've already done. And so we see this a lot too. A variation on that is doing a network hub and spoke, where, say, shared services reside inside of a single network. Maybe that's where the connectivity from the office or the existing data center or whatever the case may be is going to land in there. You've got shared services like an LDAP or an AD or something like that. And then the other networks that are in the cloud kind of just phone into that central network and consume whatever resources they need, but otherwise sit in their own isolated network. And then something that we actually just launched publicly today is XPN. So that stands for Cross Project Network. And this is kind of a variation on, well, it's really not a variation on anything, but if you want all your resources to reside in the same network, if you want all of your projects, if you want all of your features, if you want all of your services in the same project, but what you want to avoid is teams deciding on their own what are the network permissions, what are the actions that you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, where the route's going to go, and all those sorts of things. What you can do is create an XPN network where the ownership of that XPN network is, say, for a networking team. They are going to decide all the permissions. They're going to decide what the firewalls look like and so on. And then they grant permission to other projects to say, you are granted permission to instantiate resources within this XPN. And you're going to own those resources. You're going to own those virtual machines and so on. But you are not going to own the network. You're just going to sit in the network, and we are going to manage that network for you. And so that lets you have a shared global network or a shared regional network, depending on what you want, without having to share out permissions to managing the database or managing the network. So next, this is very much related to what the network design looks like. What kind of connectivity will you have to existing resources? So if we're talking about migration, there's an existing resource somewhere. And how do you want to connect to it? And I think, like the network design, there's not a right answer here. There are just different options. So I think one of the first options that most people think of is creating a VPN tunnel, an encrypted site-to-site tunnel between, say, your data center and up to Google Cloud. And I think a lot of projects start that way. The next level is leasing out a line with a partner. So getting a certain amount of guaranteed capacity over a private line connecting between Google and yourself. Certainly an option. And then finally, actually, what is also a totally valid option is companies that say, you know what, we've got this stuff in our data center, and that's staying there. And what we're doing is we are redeploying, we are moving applications by, not by actual transferring of bits, but actually these things are just going to be recreated in the cloud. We don't want to have that connection between our existing resources and our ongoing resources. And so there are different ways to look at this and different kind of trade-offs, and it kind of depends very much on kind of what you're looking for and what you're trying to get out of a migration. Also, not all of these not all of these decisions have to be long-term. They don't have to be the last and final decision on this. We also see a lot of customers say, well, while we're in our transition phase, we're going to actually lease out a lot of capacity between our data center and Google so we can transfer things more quickly, we can have more, a wider pipe to Google Cloud, and then after we're done, actually, we're just going to turn it off. So you have 2, 3, 6 months, 12 months, whatever the case may be, of a lease line, and then you turn it off afterwards. And then finally, what does this look like for developers as they use the cloud? So if you consider a company when leadership has made the decision, yes, we're moving to Google Cloud, we're happy for it for all these reasons, we've made our decision. Operations knows about all this, it's like, okay, well, data centers are closing down for whatever reason, we're moving to cloud. There's a very good chance, especially as organizations grow, that not every developer is going to know about this. Not every developer is going to be in on every discussion, every decision. They're carrying on, they're doing their job, they're fixing bugs, creating features, releasing new products, whatever the case may be. They're not part of this process. And so understanding that point of view and making sure that developers, when they move to the cloud, have a particular workflow that makes sense. And then this really, again, it comes down to what a company wants to do. How do you want to make that workflow for your developers, essentially internal customers? Are you going to keep it the same and try to make all the changes on your own back end so that whatever tooling they use kind of seems rather kind of seamless? Like, oh, I used to be deploying to a San Francisco data center, and now I'm deploying to US Central. Otherwise, my life is the same. Or are you saying, you know what? We're taking this chance. We're going to change everything that we did. We don't like the old system. Here's the new system. We're going to do that. And these all come with kind of varying levels of effort and operational overhead, depending on where you want to go. If you want to do a lot of, homework for your operations team to make it easier for, say, feature developers, you can do that. Or if you want to say, you know what, we're all in the same boat. We're making this big transition. Feature developer is going to help out the operations team as well, and varying levels of effort in between there. So, if you're not already using some sort of automation pipeline, if you're not using continuous integration, continuous deployment, this is actually a great opportunity to start using it because it makes migrations much easier. If you're already using it, please continue to do so. I'm sure you've already noticed that it makes your life easier. And then finally, with compute, what we like to say is, when doing a migration, don't try to change everything at once. So try to do something like for like as much as possible. So if you're using, if you're running on bare metal, if you're using virtualized machines, continue to do that. Use virtual machines and try to compare or find comparable versions among instance types. But I think one thing that's important to look at when you do that is look at the actual resources you're consuming on a virtual machine rather than ones that you have. So if you've got a 64-core box that's running whatever application, but you're actually only at like 10% CPU usage, you may not need a 64-core machine. And then finally, if you're using containers, please, again, continue to do so. We like them a lot. They run pretty well. All right, Brian, that's got to be it, right? It's ready to go.
We got pipes and a foundation.
Yeah.
And you want to move on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're on the sales team, right?
Yes.
Okay. And on the engineering side of the house, we like to do a little bit more. No, you're not ready to move.
Man. Fine.
Yeah. So we built the plumbing and the foundation, Peter Mark, but the first application needs to be selected. What's going to move into the house first? In theory, it could be anything, and there's a lot of different points of view over like what the first thing you should move is. I've talked to some customers that say it's only exciting when you move the hardest thing first. I don't encourage that. A lot of people prefer something that's a little bit cleaner and is going to create less disruption in the business. So I'll talk about commonalities, not like guarantees of what's kind of a good, easy thing to move first. Generally, you want something that has few, if any, dependencies. It's not talking to 30 or 50 different machines within the data center. You want something that's running Linux or Windows and fairly modern. If you're running Red Hat 4 or Windows 2003, that's probably not where you want to start in terms of getting your application over to cloud. And then this is purely just recommendation, take it for what it's worth. Internal can be better than external. Most companies would prefer to aggravate their employees than their customers. So if you want to move an internal system that's inward facing and see if that works, it tends to be a little bit better place to start than just your web-facing property.
All right. I know you're going to tell me no, but I mean, we got to be ready to move now, right? I mean, what else is there?
We're ready.
Oh, thank
You made it.
Oh, finally. Jeez.
Yeah. You've been so eager, but we finally got
I
there.
know. I just want to move.
We got the house. All right. So as long as you're running a supported operating system, you should be fine. As long as this is one application, it should be relatively straightforward. If you've got the CI/CD pipeline that Peter Mark talked about, that's awesome. You can just redeploy to a new target, Google Cloud. We just announced our VM migration service, so that's an awesome way to move virtual machines or physical machines. If you want to go that way and just copy the machine into the cloud, it makes things pretty easy in terms of a migration. If the application has a database, move that at the same time. You're only doing one move here, so the prudent thing is to pause the application, pick a downtime window, and just go slow and go gradual and don't rush it. If you guys get a chance to talk to Lush, I think they moved their entire website in the course of 22 days. I don't encourage that. It's an option, but it leads to long nights and stress. I'm going to give you some best practices here. They're not in any particular order. We put them down in the way we thought to be best. So first, stage the migrations. Try to schedule it. Try to have a defined period you're going to do this in. Don't try to rush this out on artificial deadlines, but take your time and do it correctly as opposed to forcing it. And create clear goals for your migrating team. Define success. Make it very clear what you're trying to achieve, so that when you've done the migration, you can say this was successful or this was not successful. And then you may wish to offer guidance on what kind of instance types to use, what kind of storage products and databases. Typically, you're going to find your team isn't particularly familiar with cloud, so it's going to be critical that you give some guidance. And then as you develop this expertise, make sure the teams are transferring it from one to the next, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you try to move an additional application within your business. As Peter Mark mentioned, deployment tooling, it's a great idea. If you don't have it, get it. It'll make your life a lot easier in the long term. The businesses we see moving really fast in migration have this capability in place. It certainly helps. And then monitoring tooling. So just a kind of a pro tip here, if you're going to monitor something, don't host it on the same service you're monitoring, in case anyone followed last week. But generally, if you're going to have something, monitor it. We have Stackdriver. It's a great tool. There's lots of them out there. But if you're going to be in the cloud, have that set up as part of the migration as well. And then finally, test after you migrate. Make sure it's all working and have some definition of what working means to you. And now let's look at what it means to move data. Just some basic rules, again, not in a particular order. Like data size, it's kind of obvious, but in some ways it isn't. Data size dictates difficulty. The bigger it is and the smaller your bandwidth, the more challenge you're going to have moving data. Relational schemas tend to be easier too. Things you're not using very often are easier to move as well because you're not dealing with the fast incremental updates. Large data sets require planning. If you're going to move, I think Evernote mentioned moving 70 petabytes or was it 30 petabytes in 70 days? That requires a lot of planning. You don't just show up and do that. There's only so much you can push over the wire. There's only so many trucks you can bring up to your data center. And we like to look at this chart as just a way to think about it, to understand the scale of the problem. Just some basic math here. So if you're going to move 100 terabytes, roughly 25 hard drives over 100 megabyte wire, it's going to take you 124 days. If you can use Cloud Interconnect and get a 10 gigabyte per second link, that same time is 30 hours, and just a dramatic difference in terms of your ability to move things. And this is up on the Google Cloud website if you guys want to look at it and just get a sense of the scale of the problem you're taking on. Yeah, so in case you're curious about this chart, this is available on, there's a solution actually that's relatively recently released, maybe a month ago or so, is transferring big data sets to GCP. So we literally just stole it from that page, but then there's a whole lot of detail about how that works and different strategies and advice on how to do that. And it's probably important to evaluate the different storage options within the cloud. It's not, if you're not familiar with cloud, it can be a little bit daunting at first. It was for me when I joined cloud. And just because you use a certain data type today doesn't mean you should use that going forward in the future. So just understand the different options between block and object and the others, and understand what it means for you from a performance perspective, and then understand what it means from a cost perspective as well. And then consider the data structures you're moving to. So if you change your storage system, be aware what the differences are and how that's going to impact your application.
can I just stop for 1 second? So this is actually a question that comes up quite a bit when we are helping customers move. Is this is what we're using today. What does that translate to? We are using MySQL. We're using Postgres. We're using Cassandra. How does that map to? What do I take here that maps directly to here? And sometimes there's an easy answer. It says, well, if you're using MySQL, you can continue to use MySQL. That's fairly straightforward. But sometimes it's not as an easy answer. If you say, we have 15 Cassandra clusters, what should I move it to? The answer is probably not any one thing. It's not necessarily going to be, say, Bigtable. It's not necessarily going to be Spanner, whatever the case may be. And so finding out and figuring out where data moves is actually can be one of the harder parts of a migration. The actual mechanics of doing it can often be not that difficult. It's the decision process is much more difficult. And so I think that most of Google, like database products in particular, if you go from Cloud SQL to Data Store, Bigtable, Spanner, and even BigQuery in certain circumstances, I think they have well-defined use cases, but they also have crossover use cases where there's a bit of a gray area in between where you think, well, I've got a database that is let's say not really relational. I think it could probably fit into Data Store or Bigtable. Which one should I use? And sometimes the answer was like, well, you probably could use both. And figuring out which one is actually the best one comes down to a few different factors. It usually comes to how much are you going to spend on it. Where is it most optimized? How are you going to use it for this particular use case? But we often get questions like, what is the direct mapping? Exactly how does this map into that? What is the one thing? And more often than not, there's not the one thing. There's a few things that could work. So it really does take actual evaluation and testing of the particular system to find out what works best. Sorry.
Oh, thanks. Every now and again, you make great sense. I appreciate you chiming in.
So that's it, right? There's nothing else, right?
No. So eager beat.
What else? Okay, fine. Maybe I'll talk about other things. So we touched on this a little bit in best practices in terms of actually finishing a migration. A lot of the customers that I talk to when we kind of talk through this particular flow, and we do actually talk about this quite a bit, is I often say, like, you're not done migrating until you actually do tests, because you don't really know what you've done, or that you've been successful at what you've done until you test it. And so certainly unit tests, if you're not doing them, you should absolutely be doing them, but run those once they're in there, make sure things are working. Then functional tests. Have somebody sit down and say, okay, well, this is how our web app used to work. This is how it works now. Great, it works, keep using it, or, oh, no, it broke at like step 3. What happened? We thought we set it up the same way. Test it and make sure that it actually works before you say, yeah, I'm done. And then I think something that people often forget is actually load testing. So let's say you have this web application that's capable of supporting like 10,000 concurrent connections in your existing infrastructure. Port it over. Yes, it passes unit tests. Yes, it passes functional tests, working the same way. Let it go to production, and then half hour into real users using it, you realize that it only supports 10 concurrent connections, not 10,000. And that's a big difference, and that's a big problem. So you don't really know if it's working until you figure out what its performance capabilities are. And so like a dramatic change like that would mean, probably there's some sort of configuration problem, something like that. But you want to figure that out before you say, release it to production, say, yeah, this is ready to go. We're comfortable with that. And then finally, monitoring, and again, Brian touched on this a little bit. We see a lot of companies come in kind of essentially flying blind. And if you're not monitoring, if you're not using some sort of tool, whether it's Stackdriver, whether it's your own tool, whether it's a third-party tool, there's no real way to kind of figure out how things are moving and how things have been done. So you really don't know that you're done. You don't know that the application is working unless you can actually monitor what it's doing. And again, so this is actually critical. This is essential to finishing a migration because you don't know it otherwise. And then finally, that alerting is great, but it's not enough unless you're actually getting, the monitoring is great. It's not enough unless you're getting alerts based on what happens. So if you're monitoring everything and you're monitoring the right things and the monitors go all the way to 100% because you're using too much CPU, you filled up your disk, whatever it is, and nothing happens because of that, that's kind of only half the work. You have to be able to alert on that. You have to be able to tell people this is becoming bad. A situation is getting worse. Action needs to be taken. Somebody needs to take care of that. And so alerting and monitoring really very much go hand in hand. And too often we see kind of only half of that solution in there. So how about now? Are we done?
For now, I think we are.
Yeah? What comes next? Oh, you get the clicker. What comes next?
How about a larger migration? You ready for the next one? Seriously, migrations can be difficult. They can be involved, they can be lengthy, but they don't have to be complicated. Whether you're moving one application or 1,000, the general path is the same.
And so this is something that we've seen. Oh, sorry.
No, I mean, so just it's a basic process. You pick applications, you move data, rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
You'll get through it.
And so, I mean, this is something that we talk about over and over with different customers. And the reason why, again, this is why this topic is moving a single application rather than moving hundreds of applications, because actually the workflow is the same. And this is what we see. So you take whatever snapshot of what you have to move that makes sense inside of your head, whether it's moving the whole thing, whether it's moving subsections, teams, single applications at a time. It actually is pretty much the same process over and over. Sorry, I stepped all over you.
No, great. But at the end, you're going to end up with a beautiful house. So, so thank you guys very much.